Day 525 of this Trump administration, which now finds itself facing twin battles that will likely define the Trump presidency for years to come. For starters, there is that opening on the Supreme Court, which the president made sure to bring up again today.
We're going to pick ourselves one great United States Supreme Court justice. We're going to start working on that process. We've already started, and hopefully we're going to make you very proud.
And tonight there was confirmation that a formidable White House lobbying effort aimed at potentially wobbly Republican senators is already up and running before there is even a nominee that we know of. Press Secretary Sarah Sanders wrote tonight that the president met with Senators Grassley, Collins, Murkowski, Manchin, Donnelly, and Heitkamp to discuss the Supreme Court vacancy. The POTUS team also talked with more than a dozen other senators today as part of ongoing outreach to get views and advice from both sides of the aisle. The other battle this president is fighting, and the other front we are covering tonight, would be, of course, the Mueller investigation. And this one line from the president's Twitter feed this morning may say it all. This is the American president pointing out, quote, Russia continues to say they had nothing to do with meddling in our election. Again, that's the Russian argument, long ago disproven by our U.S. intelligence community. The president also attacked the special counsel by name today, quote, when is Bob Mueller going to list his conflicts of interest? Why has it taken so long? Will they be listed at the top of his $22 million report? What about the 13 angry Democrats? Will they list their conflicts with crooked Hillary? And what is going on in the FBI and DOJ with crooked Hillary? The DNC and all of the lies, a disgraceful situation. The president's comments were a curtain raiser, really, for today's hearing, where his team, the Republicans in the House, went after the president's own appointees, the FBI director and most especially Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein.
And it's really the Rosenstein investigation. You appointed Mueller. You're supervising Mueller. It seems like you should be recused from this more so than Jeff Sessions.
Congressman, I can assure you that if it were appropriate for me to recuse, I'd be more than happy to do so.
And I want to know why you won't give us what we've asked for.
Sir, I certainly hope that your colleagues are not under that impression. That is not accurate, sir. And
it is accurate. We have caught you hiding information.
If you have evidence that this president acted inappropriately, present it to the American people. Whatever you got, finish it the hell up.
Said the man who spent nearly 2.5 years and over $7 million investigating Hillary Clinton and Benghazi and found no evidence of wrongdoing. That was followed by more questions to Rosenstein about the length of the investigation.
Is the special counsel's investigation taking too long? Has he deliberately slowed his pace?
Sir, I can assure you that Director Mueller is moving as expeditiously as possible.
Mr. Wright, are you one of those 13 angry Democrats that my Republican colleagues keep referring to?
I do not consider myself an angry Democrat.
Mr. Rosenstein, are you a Democrat?
I'm not a Democrat, and I'm not angry.
There are reports the special counsel is opening up new angles of inquiry in the Russia investigation. Tonight, the Washington Post says Mueller's team is looking at ties between Brexit supporters linked to Russian officials and the Trump campaign. There are also reports that Mueller has subpoenaed another former aide to longtime Trump advisor Roger Stone. That aide, Andrew Miller, reported to have worked briefly for Mr. Stone around the GOP convention 2016. We heard from another longtime Trump associate today, Michael Cohen, sending this message, quote, my family and I are owed an apology after 2 years, 15 hours of testimony before House and Senate under oath and producing more than 1,000 documents. Dossier misreports 15 allegations about me. My entire statement must be quoted. I had nothing to do with Russian collusion or meddling. It's unknown what may have prompted that. Emily Jane Fox of Vanity Fair reports tonight that as Cohen debates whether to cooperate with the feds, one person she spoke to wished to get a message out to Cohen. That person said, quote, please let him know that he could go down in history as the man that saved his country. I think his family would be so proud of him. On that note, let's bring in our leadoff panel on a Thursday evening. Kimberly Atkins, chief Washington reporter for the Boston Herald, Jonathan Lemire, White House reporter for the Associated Press, and Cynthia Oxney, a former federal prosecutor, veteran of the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department. Cynthia, I'd like to begin with you, if that's okay, and that is this. The center left, and the left woke up this morning after the fog of the news about Justice Kennedy leaving the court with the realization that this president will be selecting a judge, a man or a woman, who will be seated on the court, presumably in time, to potentially adjudicate the President of the United States. What's your thinking about that?
Well, I think their first thought was this would probably be somebody who would help overturn Roe v. Wade, and that somewhere between 15 and 18 states, abortion would be illegal within the next year. So that was the first thought. The second thought is, of course, one more tragedy for what's happening to our justice system. And it doesn't appear to me that there's really a way to stop it. The president is meeting with these senators to shore that up. I mean, all we can do, I think, at this point is hope and pray that some of the women, the female Republican senators come through and stick with their strong feeling that Roe v. Wade is the law of the land and should be upheld. But really, it's kind of a hopeless time.
Kim Atkins, on that note, the president wakes up in Wisconsin and starts on social media talking about Robert Mueller. What do you think that's about?
I mean, it's about what he has been railing against for months now, this investigation, no matter what other wins he may have, and the ability to appoint another Supreme Court justice and really galvanize the entire Republican Party around him. I can't think of a bigger political win for him this week, but he is still so focused on this investigation, which leads people to wonder, and some Democrats have been wondering aloud, if there would be a conflict in him appointing a Supreme Court justice who would ultimately may be asked to decide whether the president, if Robert Mueller subpoenas him or tries to compel his testimony and he refuses, that would go to the Supreme Court. Can a president be indicted? That's a question that would go to the Supreme Court. If the president fires Robert Mueller, what, if any, recourse Congress or other investigators would have? That's also a question that's open legally. So for the president to be in the position to appoint the person who is ultimately deciding that, you have senators like Cory Booker openly saying that that would be inappropriate in a way to push back on that. We also know that the president has reportedly at times been grumbled that Neil Gorsuch, Justice Neil Gorsuch, hasn't been as loyal to him as he wanted. So the question is arising: will the president put a loyalty test to the Supreme Court nominee that he puts forward? It really ties together this Supreme Court pick and this Mueller investigation in a really unique way.
Jonathan Lemire, our colleagues over at the New York Times tonight are out with a clean kill. Maggie Haberman, Adam Liptak, I will quote from it tonight. President Trump singled out Justice Kennedy for praise. Even while attacking other members of the Supreme Court, the White House nominated people close to him to important judicial posts. Members of the Trump family forged personal connections. Their goal was to assure Justice Anthony M. Kennedy that his judicial legacy would be in good hands should he step down at the end of the court's term that ended this week, as he was rumored to be considering. Allies of the White House were more blunt, warning the 81-year-old justice that time was of the essence. There was no telling, they said, what would happen if Democrats gained control of the Senate after the November elections and had the power to block the president's choice as his successor. I know you are of the mind that things Supreme Court justice related are areas where this White House has performed.
That's right. This is the second time for a White House that's been gripped with such dysfunction, more often than not. They effectively vetted and rolled out the pick of Judge Gorsuch last year, and of course he was confirmed and took his seat on the bench. And now this. And the Kennedy's departure is actually sort of a two-part strategy that led us to this moment. One that predates Trump. Let's remember, of course, that Mitch McConnell would not hold hearings for Merrick Garland, President Obama's choice, in 2016, saying that this wouldn't be right for a lame duck president to nominate someone to the bench. The Republicans for a while now have really prioritized Supreme Court seats, saying that was their strategy. Even as they saw sort of long-term demographic trends in this country going against them, the country becoming more urban and perhaps less white, they thought that a bulwark could exist in the Supreme Court. And they moved forward in this way. And Donald Trump, as a candidate, smartly released these names of potential justices, which allowed Republicans, some who were very lukewarm on him, to say, well, I may not like everything about Donald Trump, but if I vote for him, I can get a justice that will uphold my values. And then we're seeing in a lot of this reporting how the Trump White House, including Ivanka Trump, the president himself, others around him, sort of sealed the deal with Justice Kennedy and made him feel comfortable, willing to step aside, thinking that someone that would share his ideological values, his views on the law, would take his place.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.